This is a lecture on the Romans in Lanarkshire, which I have recorded and previously given this talk as a talk to Colburn, but I thought that you might like this, and if you have any comments or questions, please get back to us either by email or phoning us, and I'd be glad to answer your questions. But this is going to be the format of lectures for the moment, and I shall invite various people to give talks, but I shall do quite a few talks, which as they get finished will be distributed to the members and will be on our website and indeed on Facebook and also on YouTube. But I wish to thank all the members for their help. I know that you're not getting what you would normally get, but rest assured that your membership money is being used to finance this set of talks, because we have to give money to the people who do lectures outside in order to encourage them to give us talks. Thank you. This is a view of the Temple of Vespasian and the Arch of Septimius Severus. These emperors were both involved in the history of the Romans in Lanarkshire, which I am going to describe to you in the course of this presentation. When the Romans came to Scotland, in particular Clydesdale, they obviously encountered Celtic people who were living here. This is a view taken about 30-40 years ago of the defences at Cairngrive. You can see obviously in this photograph the quarry that is almost at the point of destroying the Iron Age defences. This hill fort overlooks Pitnane. It was a powerful hill fort, probably built in the 2nd century BC, maybe on the site of an earlier fortification. It belonged at the time of the Roman invasion to a tribe called the Damnonii. The Damnoni's name, translated into English, means the wild ones. We mustn't imagine that the people who lived in Iron Age Scotland were noble savages. No, they weren't. They were people just like you and me. They were very resourceful. These ladies here are wearing the sort of clothing that you would have found Celtic people in Scotland wearing at the time of the Roman invasion. They used plants and roots to create dyes. For example, the green dye used for the cloth on the right was made from onions, for example. Nettles too were used to create dye. There was a substantial use too of ground earths and so on to create dyes as well. This here is a typical Iron Age hut. There's a reconstruction down south of what you'd expect to find in the interior of a Iron Age hut. As you can see, it's quite well constructed, and the ones that were in use in the times when the Romans invaded were quite well appointed and made good use of natural resources such as wood and metal, such as it was. It must be stated that these huts were quite solid buildings. Down in the south of England, where this hut was constructed, they had a storm in the 1970s. The modern houses were actually badly damaged, especially the tiled roofs. But this type of hut with its thatched roof was not damaged in the least. The average Iron Age hut would take probably about 5 tons of timber to construct. This is a picture which is taken of an illustration in General Roy's Military Antiquities of Scotland, which was published several years after Roy's death, but this particular picture was recorded as far back as 1751. It shows Castle Dykes in the era prior to the agricultural revolution, and it shows Corby Hall with a fine garden by it. These old buildings are now no longer there, but does give you a good idea of the main fort. This is an interesting plan which is made from an aerial photograph by the Royal Commission of the different camps over to my I mentioned that the Romans liked to tax people on previous occasions when I've been talking about Romans, and I mentioned the Celtic field system, and if the locals were involved in working the fields, they would have been allowed to keep some of the grain, but also they were taxed. And the way it was done was by asking them to put their corn in a large measure called a modius. And this is an example of a modius belonging to the time of the Emperor Domitian. Domitian was the emperor in Scotland in the 80s, 86 AD. He was a successor to the Emperor Titus, and it is probably in his time the decision was made, Templar, to withdraw troops to fight in Germany around about this date. But coming back to the core measure, this one, which was recovered from Carveran on Hadrian's Wall, was a bit of a cheat, really, because the modius was really larger than it should be, so that the people collecting the tax actually made a substantial amount out of conning the natives to give them more by way of tax than they really should. But it's really quite an interesting item. This is the Antonine Fort, shown quite clearly in this aerial photograph. To the right of it is the network of fields, Celtic fields, and it may be that the Romans used maybe even native labour as well as the troops who are stationed here to breed cattle, to process the cattle for making, turning the leather into shoes and to tents and many other things. Also, crops may be grown here to supply the soldiers with food, and also oats might have been grown to provide food for the horses. So this is quite an interesting case of how the Romans saw Castle Dykes really as a major supply base for the Romans in southern Scotland. Over on the right, you can see the edge of the what's called the Flavian camp. That's the camp used by Agricola. This is a photograph that I took myself many years ago. This shows the main camp, which is playing card shaped, and it also shows the extensions to the fort. This near this line of trees, this line of trees is now away, and this area was used by the traders to park up their wagons and horses and so on. Also, it was used by some of the people traveling on imperial business. And if one looks further down the slope towards the solitary tree, there seems a building down in this area, which was a bathhouse. We found actually tiles belonging to this bathhouse. Also, we see some of the trackways leading down towards the Clyde, and we also see another trackway leading into the camp. The dates of these are uncertain, but we can see, if we return to the fort, that the actual ramparts have been replaced several times during the history of this camp. This view of Castle Dykes is based on the work that was done by Professor Anne Robertson, who dug Castle Dykes in the 50s. During this time, a number of things were discovered. Section was taken across the ramparts, and it seemed that there are two main phases, one Flavian and the other Antonine. She also discovered during the course of the excavations a headquarters building which has three rooms at the back. Of these, the central room was used to keep the standards of the Ala. The two side rooms were used for accounts and also for storing the pay for the unit. Interestingly enough, we found that in both the time of Trajan and Antoninus Pius, the Roman government were conning the soldiers by giving them plated denarii. That meant that the denarii had a silver outside but a copper core, which was a bit unjust. Then you see a cross room here where there could be meetings with the different soldiers and tasks assigned, and the larger space could be used for detachments to meet and orders to be issued to them. The garrison was divided up into a number of what they call turmi. Turmi were basically units of 30 cavalrymen. And on the right is maybe a granary. Certainly granaries were stone built in forts like this, like the headquarters building. The other buildings were initially built of timber, but we have found a barracks which obviously was built of stone. We shall come to that later. This picture gives you an idea of the main fort of 8.5 acres, which is bisected by a row of trees. On the side nearer the river, one can see the outline more clearly, but the problem is with persistent deep ploughing, the things that we could see some years ago have more or less disappeared, and this is why it's important to look at earlier photographs. This is a particular important seal which was discovered by my good friend Tom Hislop with his metal detector. This was probably about 1980 or thereabouts. It has on it the letters ASEB. This is short for the Ala Sebosiana. Now, the Ala was an auxiliary cavalry unit which was based for a while at Castle Dykes. It is interesting because there are letters at Carlisle which refer to this unit, and these letters date back to the time of the General Agricola, and one of the members of the unit was actually the aide-de-camp to Agricola. The unit itself was recruited in France by a man called Sebosianus. Gallic cavalry were a very important arm of the Roman army. Auxiliary troops were not the same as legionnaires. They weren't Roman citizens, or indeed Italian citizens for that matter. They were particularly useful in Scotland, this unit, and near Inverness, in Inveresk, a gravestone was found of a member of the Ala Sebosiana. Just how long they were based at Castle Dykes, we shall never know. This is a picture that was developed from a resistivity meter survey that we did of part of the camp at Castle Dykes, and we reckon that we actually found part of a barrack block, and you can see from this photograph some of the walls and some of the partitions within this building. The other thing it could be is it could be a stables, and that the bits jutting out represent the stalls where the horses were kept. This is another picture on the right here of the Antonine camp, which was built when Lollius Urbicus brought soldiers into Scotland at the request of the Emperor Antoninus Pius, and subsequently built Hadrian's Wall. The oldest coin found at Castle Dykes was of Valerius Flaccus. This silver denarius was found some years back by a good friend of mine, Nisbet Laurie. This is not how the original looked, but it gives you a good idea of what the coin was about. Now, it so happened that a man called Valerius Flaccus, who was perhaps the great-great-grandson of this man, was actually involved in the campaign in Scotland, and he admired the Emperor Vespasian for this undertaking, and he wrote a book called the Argonautica, which cast Vespasian as the hero Jason of the Argonauts. And I wonder if Valerius Flaccus had this coin in his pocket and maybe lost it at Castle Dykes. Just wonder why somebody was wandering around with such an old coin in their pocket. But nevertheless, it's an interesting idea. This is a coin of the Emperor Trajan, which was found at Castle Dykes. As you can see, it's in quite good condition. It's of piety. The reason why this coin is important is it dates to 100 AD, second year of Trajan's reign. It shows that initially Trajan was not for withdrawing soldiers from Scotland. Indeed, as it was found underneath the rampart, it would suggest it was lost during the construction of the rampart. And now we've probably got at least 3 phases of ramparts. Castle Dykes, the first one, the Flavian period, the second one, Trajanic, the next one is Antonine, and possibly another Antonine after that. So the whole story of Castle Dykes is a lot more complicated. Also indicates perhaps that the story of the missing 9th Legion in Scotland is not necessarily true. This is a picture of the Emperor Hadrian addressing his troops from Trajan's column. Trajan's column is a very useful tool for looking at the way in which the Roman soldiers and the auxiliary soldiers were protected. The group that is addressing here, with a variety of shields and so on, seems to be a group of auxiliary soldiers rather than ones which were legionnaires. They have a variety of different armor, and some of them have oval shields. The Romans copied some of the weapons that they used from the people they conquered. For example, a long sword or spatha was copied from the Celts. This gemstone was found by a friend of mine, Alec Walkinshaw. It's quite an important piece, is this. It is a gemstone in Chalcedony, and it shows the warrior Mars. I only wish that this little gemstone had been complete, but if it hadn't been for Alec's eagle eyes, we would have never have found this. This is something that I found myself, which remains of a ring, quite a heavy ring. It seems to be bronze rather than being low-grade gold, unfortunately, but the face is a Celtic-style face, and it may have been lost by one of the Alla Sabosiana who were based here at Castle Dykes. To be honest, I haven't seen anything quite like it. This is a piece of amphora. Amphora were brought to Castle Dykes from a number of different places, Spain and France in particular, and contained wine, olive oil, and a fish sauce called garum, which the Romans were particularly fond of. There were two varieties of amphora, one which had a pointy bit at the end, and the other was sort of globular. By looking at the composition of the clay, it is possible for archaeologists to tell exactly where these amphorae came from. This is these are two bits of Samenware. Samenware was a type of pottery which was imported from France, in particular the area around Clermont-Ferrand. The Samenware was bought initially to Castle Dykes in the Flavian period, but it wasn't used to a wide extent until the Antonine period. And this particular piece shows Hercules struggling with the Nemean lion. Now, these pieces of pottery were produced in molds. They're called Samian after the island of Samos, but they have no connection whatsoever with that place. They were originally produced in Arezzo in northern Italy, but by the time the Romans invaded Scotland, the factories had moved to Clermont-Ferrand in France. Most of all, the Samenware was produced in France until the 3rd century AD, when the whole works was transferred to Rheinzabern in Germany, because it was cheaper to produce the Samenware there. However, we have no examples of this variety of Samenware at Castle Dykes. On the left is a bit of a thing called a mortaria, or mixing bowl. Mixing bowls of this sort had grits in the clay, and these grits were quite useful for example, grating cheese and things. And the mixing bowls too could be used to make omelets by whipping up some eggs or whatever. So quite a versatile kitchen utensil. In the Antonine phase, the last rampart was built. You can see the rampart quite clearly outlined here, and you can also see to the right of it the remains of the outer parts of the camp where the traders and so on would have stayed. Going back to the Antonine period, one of the most important Antonine camps near Lanarkshire is that of Cleghorn. Part of this site, unfortunately, has been turned into a sort of mini holiday village, which will have a detrimental effect on the visitors' interpretation of the ramparts and so on as they exist at Cleghorn. This was quite an important staging post for the Roman army as they marched north to the central belt. This here is a view of the Antonine bathhouse at Bothelhoff in the Strathclyde Park. What the visitor can see today is a bathhouse which has been removed from its original location because the artificially created lock at the Strathclyde Park would have drowned the structure. But here you can see some of the structure of the hot room at the bathhouse, and then over to the left is remains of a circular, semicircular structure which was the plunge bath, which was for cold water. And we find that in later days what happened was that when the Romans left, the natives used the bathhouse to live in and actually left some of their remains of what they had to eat in the bathhouse, which is not very hygienic. The Romans were probably in Scotland a bit longer than we think. Certainly, I don't think they left in 166 AD after a rebellion in the territory of the Brigantes. Rather, I think that the Romans stayed on until the time of the Emperor Commodus. This theory is backed up to some degree by a coin of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, which was found during excavations in the High Park in Hamilton. The coin on the right-hand side is the god of health, Phallus, and the reason Marcus Aurelius issued this coin was because later on in his reign, in the 160s, a pandemic hit the Roman Empire. It came about as a result of the success of his co-emperor Lucius Verus, who was fighting the Persians. Fortunately, the Persians were suffering from the plague. The plague spread all over the Roman Empire, and one person every 3 died of it. So it makes the present pandemic pale into insignificance. By the way, it wasn't like COVID, it was a bubonic plague, and it was the first major bubonic plague to hit Western Europe. This is a picture out of prehistoric Roman Lanarkshire, which was produced in 1976. It shows you the track of the Roman road which runs past Crawford over from coming up from Dumfriesshire over towards Peeblesshire. Also on this map, you can see what this is marked on the map as a marching camp. There's another smaller one marked B, and indeed aerial photography revealed another marching camp on the opposite side of the road. What you see running through the village of Crawford is the main train line. One of the things that was found a number of years ago was a coin of the Emperor Septimius Severus, which would suggest that, contrary to popular belief, the Romans came up both the east and the west, which would make strategic sense given the fact that they were dealing with quite a serious rebellion that had occurred prior to Septimius Severus's arrival in AD 193. We now move to consider other places that the Romans built in Clydesdale. One of the places they built a fort was at Crawford, not far from the castle there on the opposite side of the road. This was a small fort which may have contained about 180 men, but it was an important area because the Roman roads cross here, the north-south and east-west roads crossed, and therefore it was important to have a garrison at this point. The headquarters building, as you can see, number one, very much more complicated in the second Antonine period at Crawford. What they reckon there was, the archaeologists, that is to say, was that there was a mixed cavalry and infantry unit based here at Crawford. This would help them control the roads and make sure that they were safe for people to travel on. This shows the plans of the camps as they were found by the archaeologists, and there's a very small little number one, which is the Principia or HQ, and maybe next to it, number two, was a granary. You also see some barrack blocks and maybe stables, which are long latitudinal constructions. We see different way of doing things in the first Antonine period when the actual HQ building is bigger, and to the south of that lies a granary, and there seem to be a number of barrack blocks and maybe stables as well. These features are repeated in the second Antonine phase, which myself I think belongs to the AD 160s rather than any earlier. To back up the evidence that I put forward about the Romans being later in Scotland than has previously been imagined, I did find a coin of the Empress Lucilla, who was the daughter of Marcus Aurelius at Castle Dykes. She was the wife of the co-emperor Lucius Verus. The coin was quite worn, and may be that when her brother came in, the emperor, after Marcus's death, his name being Commodus, that the withdrawal from central Scotland took place in the governorship of Ulpius Marcellus in AD 186. Roman soldiers would look quite different to the ones that we would imagine. This is a late Roman cavalry helmet, and typical of the ones worn by the units of cavalry in the late Roman Empire and the 4th century AD. Unfortunately, I haven't found any bits of one Castle Dykes, but at least this will give you an idea. Along with the coin of Jovian, there was one of Julian and one of Constantine, which were found at Castle Dykes. These give credit to a story put forward by the Roman author Ammianus Marcellinus that a province long lost to the Roman Empire, was recovered and was named Valentia after the Emperor Valentinian, who at this time was emperor in the Western Empire. His brother Valens was defeated in a battle at Adrianople. By this time, Valentinian was dead and succeeded by Gratian. Because there was a problem for the Romans in that the Ostrogoths were threatening to overwhelm the Eastern Empire, troops had to be transferred from west to east, and the Romans didn't stay very long in southern Scotland as a consequence. Here we have a coin of Jovian, which was minted in 366 AD and found at Castle Dykes. The reason why it's important is it shows, along with other coins that appeared that were found at Castle Dykes, that the fort was reoccupied after the defeat of the great barbarian conspiracy by Count Theodosius. In the year after the death of Jovian, time of Valentinian, it was decided to annex southern Scotland because the Picts and the Saxons and the Scots from Ireland were causing trouble for the Romans living in Britain. There were altogether 3 coins found near each other at Castle Dykes, and the other one which was found was of the Emperor Julian. So the 3 coins were of Constantine, Julian and Jovian. That's in the correct chronological order. Julian was a remarkable man, and he in the early 360s pushed back the Germans from the Rhine frontier. Unfortunately, Julian didn't reign for very long. He was killed fighting the Persians. He was the last pagan emperor. He was a bit of a philosopher, which made him unpopular with the Christians, who didn't appreciate his respect for the old religions and philosophies. This is a gold solidus of the Emperor Valentinian, and Valentinian was Emperor of the West at the time that Count Theodosius was dispatched to deal with the great barbarian conspiracy of 363 AD. It's a magnificent coin, and this, like the other coins which I've talked about, was struck at Trier. Unfortunately, we never found any gold Roman coins, let alone a solidus of Valentinian. The reconstruction here probably gives you an accurate picture of some of the Celts who were reasonably well armed and reasonably well dressed, but their lack of military strategy meant on the occasion of a pitched battle, the Picts would be on the losing side, but towards the end of the Roman occupation, the Picts discovered the best thing was to conduct a guerrilla campaign, which was harder for the Romans to check